Thank you for coming. Before we do anything else, I'm going to assume that with a smaller audience, everybody here is Larped. Is that fair?
I haven't yet.
You sort of have.
I'm well, kind of, sort of.
An evening.
Yeah.
So I'm going to give. I had two kind of senses about this. One would be if people were like, I've not done this before, would I be welcome? I'm not going to do that talk because everybody here is kind of essentially is involved in some way or the other. So I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about my thinking around kind of the challenges I've faced in feeling welcome, and that's as someone who now owns one of the biggest games in the country, and also around how that's led me to think about how we tell stories and the types of games I want to see for people to play, and we'll go from there. And I'll try not to talk for the whole time, and feel free to interrupt with questions as they come up. I don't, it's not, it's just us, right? So there's no need to be formal about this. But I think it's probably worth, I'll just set the scene. So I'm Stuart, I have been LARPing since 2001, on and off, before and now my children come and play as well. One of them does, the other one helps with the build, but doesn't want to play, which is, that's their prerogative and that's cool. My background is like outside of LARP. I grew up as a physicist and then went into investment banking because my grandmother was like, when are you going to get a proper job? But I also kind of write and I'm kind of 6 books into kind of my author career, and I've kind of got another one coming out next year and one after the year after that. So that has also, I've learned loads about how to tell stories through that as well. And I think also kind of my lived experience has been one where I've not necessarily always chimed with the types of stories that I'm kind of seeing in the world around me, and I've kind of often kind of grown a bit grumpy around that and thought I wish there were other stories to tell. So I think what really made me think LARP is really white, and I'm going to focus largely on that, on the aspects of race here, mainly because I'm largely able-bodied, I'm not particularly neurodiverse, and so I don't feel qualified to talk about those, but I think the intersection of each of those, kind of the lessons that I've learned, and when I'm talking to the team who does have those, we do have those kind of people who would identify that way as part of our design team, we find that the things that concern me concern them too, and vice versa, and where they don't overlap, where the Venn diagram isn't a circle, what we find is actually it's like, oh yeah, okay, that's really interesting. It's easy enough to kind of fold those things into how we think about designing. But the thing that really made me sit up and kind of go, okay, we've missed something here, was 3 years ago we brought Curious Pastimes to Comic-Con for the first time. We were the first LARP company to come, much to my huge surprise, and I had a chat with Matt Pennington, and he was like, yeah, we were going to come before the pandemic, and then the pandemic hit and we weren't able to do it, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. So I was like, I was really surprised that LARP had never been to somewhere like this. You've got like this weekend, I think they're predicting 140,000 nerds, just like me, over the weekend. And I was like, how? And that's something like 28 times the number of LARPers in the country, probably. What, 28 for every one LARPer? If you kindly assume that there's 5,000 LARPers in the country, I was like, not only are we massively outnumbered, but there's loads of people there who would love LARP. And I was like, but also I discovered, I was shocked that about 30% of the people here, I think, would not be white. And that, again, to me was really shocking, because I'd already done the numbers and thought, right, so 14% of the people in the UK identify as non-white in some form or another, self-identify on the census. So I think at Curious Pastimes, when I first did those numbers, we probably had, let's say we had about 900 players at the time, this was a few years ago. We probably had me and 3 others that I could say were non-white in kind of in a non-passing sense. And I was like, statistically that's bad, right? Because just if I was to pull people at random off the street, for 1,000 players, you would have 140 people of colour, sorry. And now we're at 1,500 players, and Empire's at 3,500, and I'm talking to Matt about it, and I was like, 3,500, you should have roughly 700 people of colour. And he's like, well, we don't have 700 people of colour. I'm like, yeah, we all suffer from this problem. What is it that's kind of missing here? Because there's clearly downstairs lots of nerds like me who just don't know what they're missing yet. And I'm like, oh, okay, and so I started to think about what are our real challenges here? What are we missing? And I don't think, I've had some really bad answers given to me in my time, and I don't really want to talk about them because they were terrible. From Indians don't like stories, you know, that was one answer that was given to me. And I was like, okay, I don't really, you know, you don't know where to start with that sort of conversation, saying that doesn't really work as an excuse. But there is definitely a thing of people come and they don't see themselves. So they're like, I don't see myself doing that. So when we had the stand in October, November last year here, we have a video, we have trailers that we have an amazing head of media who's made some trailers for us. And our demographics have shifted quite a lot. So we were able to put people like me in the trailer without feeling like we were doing kind of performative representation. And we had people coming around going, oh, I thought this was a white person thing. And I was like, oh, that's super interesting. It's super interesting. And so I was like, I need to understand, I need to think about this. So I wrote a paper for the British Fantasy Society's journal on Larp and whiteness, slightly provocatively titled, but mainly because I kind of wanted a way of thinking through a bit more formally and academically why I felt there were these hurdles to people coming in. Because I don't know about you, but we certainly do, and I know Matt and the team have kind of done this, and most other UK LARPs have policies now around inclusion, and they have policies around kind of unacceptable behaviour, and they have policies around kind of equality and what to do if those things don't occur. And they do sometimes go wrong, but I think most of the big LARPs have got policies in place for us to kind of know, for everybody to know, if this happens to you, this is what you should do, and it will be resolved, right? And we've had situations which we've had to kind of resolve, but I think coming out of them, you're like, you know, we can't stop the public being dicks, but how you deal with it is as much as important about what you say.
How you resolve this, is it?
It depends on what's happened, right? So let's say we have had a racist or a homophobic incident. Typically, that person involved on the wrong side of that incident is gone, right? But and they're gone from the moment we learn about it. We will fetch them and they will be gone. We will then, you know, you learn how to do these things better, right, as they happen, unfortunately. But we also then want to kind of make sure that we are kind of working with the person who has suffered that situation, making sure they're okay, but also making sure people know that, not know that we've taken action, but those sorts of things get talked about a lot. And we want to be clear that we are aware of what's happened and that we've taken some action, and if people want to talk, then they can talk to us. What we won't do is talk about specific details, right? It's not for us to do that. We don't want to relitigate that for other people. It's not about even taking sides. We're just like, this isn't a he said, she said situation. This is just an unacceptable behaviour. Other things can be more contextual and they can be more challenging. And those sorts of things, we have a team, we have a process whereby we will work out how how to investigate it. We have an appeals process. That was my next question,
how do you investigate this? Because I'm assuming obviously in most instances where this arises, there's a legitimate basis for it.
I think if it gets to the point where someone's complaining, there's nearly always a legitimate basis. Not always. Like, you do get, like, it's a charged atmosphere where you have emotional bleed between what's fantasy and what's happening out of character. And you have situations where, you know, reasonably people have fallen out of character about something else, and it all bleeds together, and so you have to be really careful. So we aren't, others do it differently, but we aren't that interested in policing what people are doing outside of the game, unless we think it's going to cause problems at the game. But partly because I spend a lot of time working with lawyers in my professional life. I'm not going to put
I'm a lawyer, so I'm in the same.
I'm not going to put ourselves in a position where someone like me, if it was done to me, I would litigate you out of existence, because I've got the wealth to do that, and I would destroy your company on the basis that we aren't qualified to professionally investigate, we aren't qualified to professionally pass judgment. And if something like that was on the edge and I felt that I was wronged, I would destroy you. And there are other people who would do that too. And I think we want to be really careful about that, because we don't want to fall into a situation where a court goes, what do you think you were doing? So we need to, that's the big challenge there. So what we say to people is, look, if you have a complaint about something outside of the game, then it's a different process. because we aren't just going to say that person can't come, because we just can't tell. We have no idea what the merits of that situation are. Other people take it differently, and that's for everybody to kind of choose their own way. We ultimately want to make sure that people are feeling safe at a game, and that's kind of our guiding principle. But we're also quite aware that there are limits to what.
I suppose there's other ways to engage with it as well, as opposed to the stick. You use it in the general environment which is created. Yep. I'm assuming it probably acts as a de facto filter, doesn't it, for individuals who may...
Yeah, absolutely. And we do a new player briefing like many do, but at the beginning of our new player briefing at every game, we say, look, this is a no tolerance environment. On a couple of occasions when there's been headlines around this subject, I often run it and I'll say, look, trans women are women and trans men are men. Right? That's absolutely crucial, that if you're coming to this game, you understand the culture that we're building here, so that people are like, okay, there's absolutely no mistaking about the type of culture that we want to build. And that, I think, goes a long way, partly because people who might feel on the edge about those things are either going to police themselves or not come, and people who feel that it's important to them to feel safe have got a clear message from us that that's important for us, for them to feel like that for us too, right? So I think Larp on the whole has done those things relatively well. I heard some horror stories earlier in the year, but on the whole, I think it's moved really well. I don't know if that's a symptom of, or symptom's the wrong word, but I don't know if that's part of the nature of the community. But the community, I've found, is pretty welcoming. It's pretty, I mean, we're dressing up and hitting each other and talking nonsense in fields, right, and using cod medieval English.
It's not surprised that a diverse group of individuals are quite accepting of diversity.
Exactly, yeah.
I think it's worth kind of like pointing out that LARP is almost a safe space to play with that kind of thing as well. Like, some people LARP in drag. That doesn't mean they're trans, it means they LARP in drag. Like, I would potentially in the future play a male LARP character, but I'm a cis woman. It's like a safe environment. And you can make judgments about whether it's acceptable to play a different sexuality. I think that's slightly different. But wherever anyone falls on that, people do. So yeah, I think it's interesting that it's also a safe, it's supposed to be a safe place to explore. It's a fantasy land.
Yeah. Can I just build on that? So if we're saying it's permissible to play a different gendered character, what about a different character of different race? How would you feel about that as well, from someone that's coming from this perspective? I know it's a really tricky question. It
is really tricky. I think it's a really good one. And that kind of, I'm going to segue a little bit away from it and come back to it, if that's okay. Because what I want to talk about is, given all of the things that I've just said, which I think makes LARP super welcoming, why is it so monocultural in other ways? Right? Some of the intersections here are really great, and some of them are really poor. And the race one, I think, is really a really interesting one. And as I was thinking about this, I think there are some obstacles or hurdles to kind of good game design that mean that people struggle to kind of see themselves being part of it. The first one is Eurocentrism. Most LARPs that I'm aware of are they're Victorian fantasy, right? They're not, you don't see boggarts, you don't see havertrops, you don't see actual folk monsters. My favourite one is one from northern France, which is a giant snail that eats the dead. Right? You don't see monsters like that in the game.
At least it's eating the dead.
Yeah, it lives in the swamps, and anyway. So without getting too lost on that. You don't see kind of those sorts of things. What you see is Victoriana, and you see Tolkien like everywhere, right? And you see Robert Jordan everywhere in these things. But those are deeply kind of European. But I think the deeper thing for me, and this is why it's about the Victorian rather than the European bit that I struggle with, is I'd love to see Hulda, which are kind of female trolls from Scandinavia, right? I'd love to see them in a game somewhere. But I think what I struggle with is this Victorian stuff, which essentially boils down to a society that was absolutely fixated on eugenics and racial hierarchy and gender hierarchy. But I'm not as qualified to talk about that. And I think the problem with that is, and we've just come to the conclusion of a big rules review that's taken us about 18 months. We've got rid of race and species completely. And we've just said, we've relocated it in culture. And we've said, look, your culture may be this or it may be that. You may have a preponderance of people in your culture with different skin colours. That's absolutely fine, but that's your culture. There's no kind of essential link between you and everybody else. The reason being, D&D is a classic example of this. Humans tend to be able to do everything. They are tricks of the trade, right? They are ultimately capable. And orcs, who are black, are strong and barbaric. And elves, who are white, are refined and good. I mean, Gary Gygax made drow evil elves so evil they turned black, right? So stuff like that ultimately defaults to humans are diverse and versatile, but those humans aren't diverse and versatile because the default for those humans is white. They're all white. And the different colours you see, you're more likely to see in books and films which are fantasy an orc than you are a brown human, right? And that really feeds into, I think, one of the big obstacles that we see, because people come and they go, oh, I can be an orc. Oh, and your enemies are all orcs. Okay, and I'm brown, and there are no other brown people in their naked skin, as it were. What should I do? Oh, well, it's probably not for me, because you guys are going to go and white it up and to be crass about it. And I find that's a tricky one. I think another one is the political systems we tend to have at games. They tend to be uncritical of empire, and I don't mean the game, I mean the idea of empire, which for somebody whose parents on both sides suffered at the hands of different empires, I'm not comfortable with. And I know a lot of my friends who come from similar backgrounds to me are like, what the hell? Why on earth would I want to play part of an expansionary empire? I have no interest in that. And I would, I don't want to be the minority bringing it down, because hey, guess what? Lived experience. I'm supposed to be doing the fantasy. So I think big political systems like that are where those are the things are problematic. Which is why for me steampunk is like an out, right? It's literally whitewashing a Victorian colonial society for the sake of looking nice in a dress. And I'm happy to look nice in a dress, but at the same time I'm like, you can't just pretend none of that shit happened, because you are going to just make it a white space. And that, for me, again, so there's these kind of deeper ideas in how we're designing our games that I think lead to people going, I thought this was a white person thing. And I think, so I see quite a lot of that, and I've seen that in our own game, and we are kind of slowly taking steps to change that. Some of that is like, we have one of our factions are very Norse inspired, and that I have no problem with per se, except that a lot of, and it's more American than European, but a lot of white supremacists would also identify as Odinists, right? And it's not that straightforward to say, okay, let's try and separate these two things. You can, and we work hard to do that, but part of how we're working hard to do it is taking the kind of the Eddas and the old, kind of the really old kind of stories, and looking to those for kind of hooks rather than retellings. We don't want to retell Ragnarok necessarily. We don't want to retell Thor's story necessarily. And we certainly don't necessarily want to modernise it, but what we do want to do is take some thematic inspiration from those things. That, I think, moves you onto safer ground than otherwise. I think the other challenge we've seen is that so many people are used to the hero's journey as being their story type. And in a big collaborative game, that gets a bit mushed up, but it ends up becoming the big group doing the hero's journey rather than individual. So it still ends up being the hero's journey where you have a big conflict in the third act and you win by beating your enemy into the ground and overcoming your obstacles. I'm like, there are so many other types of stories to tell. And I always point to Animal Crossing as a massively popular game that is absolutely not Hero's Journey. So why don't we have more stories like that in the game where people can tell those sorts of stories amongst their little communities?
I said the best sci-fi isn't the sci-fi where there's a big battle, I said in the third act, it's the ones which actually engage with the human component of it.
Exactly, yeah.
Which is what I think Star Trek has forgotten at the moment.
No comment.
That's another brief.
But no, I do agree with that, and I think one of the things we've started to kind of we try to have a ref camp each year where we kind of all get together, our referees, and talk about it. But some of the stuff we're talking about is about the types of stories we want to tell. So we had a big battle at our last event. One of those big battles, the players arrived somewhere to disrupt a scientific experiment. It wasn't a big battle. It was a big battle, but it wasn't a big battle. Lost. Yes, they did lose.
Considerably.
But the point was is that they weren't antagonists per se. They were just busy doing their own thing. They had their own agenda and they were getting on with it. And then they were people got up in their grill and they responded decisively. But for us, that was like trying to tell different types of story, because you don't have to tell those big stories, those same stories over and over again, despite the fact that they're super popular. They're super popular because they're grounded in our culture, right? They're kind of where we go first when we're thinking about, right, what type of tale am I going to tell? Well, one of the things we're really trying to do is tell different types of story, because I think there are loads of good examples of this in wider literature. So my favourite book full stop of last year was a book called The Spear Cuts Through Water by Simon Jimenez. It's a fantastic, I'm going to sound pretentious here, it's a fantastic meta-textual text. It's a story told from multiple points of view. It's a story about stories, but it's also a story where the story is aware that it's a story, and it at some points breaks its fourth wall to itself rather than to you as the reader, and talks to its own characters talk to themselves about the fact that they are in the story. It's a fantastic story, a fantastic book, really ambitious, but but also it sounds really avant-garde, but in many ways it's an East Asian type of storytelling, and really shocking, because you don't come across that all that much in Western storytelling. But if Simon can do it in a novel like that and win loads of awards, I'm like, we can do it in the types of stories that we want to tell, right? We don't have to make it about me versus you all the time, right? It can be about collaboration. It can be. So we did a lot of. We've structured parts of our games now to be about collaboration, and in our rule set we've rebuilt it to say the best outcomes are going to be built by multiple characters with different skill sets collaborating together and designing it consciously that way. We haven't yet released this to the players for them to kind of go through the minutiae, but quite a lot, like a small proportion, it's a sizable minority, let's say 10%, are going to discover that they can't do everything anymore, because we've wanted to stop that. We wanted to stop a kind of hoarding of skill, so that someone eventually can do everything that's possible to be done. And rather we're saying that you have to specialise, so that we can push you consciously to collaborate with others. But to come for your point, I think there are, what are we doing to keep moving? Hey, I think we've kind of considered three possible options. One is, do we just put a non-white culturally themed group in the game? And I think even as I'm saying it, you can probably realise why that's not going to work. Do I want to see an Arabic group or an Indian group in the game? I'd really love to, but the thorny question then becomes, what if it's all played by white people? I'm like, that's not so good. But then it's also not so good if it's all Indian group is all played by Indian people. Because I'm like, ghetto, great. But, it's also not what we want. So we've kind of gone, we don't want real world influences at the surface of our game. We don't, is there anything new under the sun? No, but there's new ways of telling stuff. And as someone very famous whose name, Octavia Butler said, there are new suns, right? There are always new suns. So there's always new stuff to be done. And so we've said to ourselves, okay, so what if we did everything novel? And I think the problem there is although it sounds brilliant on paper, you can't do everything novel, because people need cultural touch points. They need hooks, yeah, right. So you can't do it, because you still have a game that has to wash its face financially, and not leave all the organisers kind of going,
Otherwise, you're never able to sue anyone.
Yeah, exactly. I've lost all my money, and that's the end of the game. It was really nice while it lasted. So it's like, right, where do we end up? And we were like, okay, so what we want is, we know we need the familiar. Right? You need the familiar, because people have to be able to find their way into the game. And I always refer back to Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's point that he told it from the point of view of the hobbits, because that was your way into a world that was otherwise completely kind of built out.
Is this the one for badly writing, or?
This is about how we're designing games to be more inclusive.
Oh, right. I was going for the bad writing one.
You're welcome to stay, or you're welcome to go.
Okay, sorry.
That's all right.
I think there's some valid criticisms of multiple large festival Larps of where the ways that certain water has been designed lends itself almost the players can do it almost accidentally, like directly into cultural appropriation. I know that I've struggled with this, and it's like, okay, how do I fit this brief without appropriating things? And it can be hard, which is like not blaming anyone for how it was designed originally. I see how it happened, but it needs to change. You know?
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think what that comes down to. So, like to take an example of our, like in our back garden for Curious Pastimes, we have a group that's Arthurian inspired. A few years ago, we had a group arrive with lots of red crosses on white shields, and deeply uncomfortable for me and others. So a conversation had to be had where we were like, can we please change that? We don't want to poo on your game, but what you've got to understand is the cultural implications that you're bringing into a game, the baggage that you're bringing in. We can't let that be part of the game. Not only that, but we don't have any Christianity or any kind of reference to Christianity in the game. So the crosses, they make no sense in the context of what we're doing, right? The Arthuriana is absolutely kind of the fantasy Gawain and the Green Knight. It's got more Saxon than it has kind of French Christianity. And so, you know, we feel a bit more entitled to kind of say, we don't want that. And we've also, like the game historically had a lot of reference to the Chaos Gods from Games Workshop. That's now gone because we've said we don't want that either, partly because it's somebody else's IP and we've got our own stuff that we've written, so, but also because we're like, oh, it's not that great. No. So let's just move it. Like, in its own context, it's absolutely fine, but in this game, that's not what we want. And so I think as a game runner, you can have those conversations if you're prepared to. They're not always easy. How do people receive
that sort of critique?
Some people are absolutely fine. Other people are like, well, I've been doing this for 10 years. And we're like, yeah, the world's changed and it's not what we want now. Mm-hmm. And that can be a more challenging conversation. So you can, this is a comeback, I always come back to this, look, I'd love to be able to press the button and say, this is the way it is now. More often than not, it's like, look, by this time next year, we want all of that gone. We know you've spent money on your kit. We don't want you to feel like it's totally wasted, but this is the direction we're going in. And if it's still here next year, we will have to say to you, you can't use it. You can't do those things. And that's the easiest way we've found. That doesn't make necessarily the conversations easy because people are still like, there's two responses. Often it's like, I've been doing this for a long time, what is it a problem now? But also people will be like, oh, but I don't see it as a problem. And that's a challenging conversation to have because sometimes you have to wind it like a few steps back and go, okay, I'm going to have to do the labour here to explain to you why that's a difficult
I suppose if you're taking that upon yourself, then
you kind of put yourself into it, but you always kind of hope that people kind of go, yeah, okay, I get it, yeah, that's not a problem. But then if they were going to do that, more often than not, they wouldn't have done the thing that they were doing that you want to talk to them about in the first place. I think
so at least a degree of embarrassment though. You might be one of those you kind of think, oh, that'd be cool.
Yeah, people feel a little bit embarrassed.
And then you have that innate, you know, crap, I shouldn't have done this. But
and more often than not, it's because people haven't spotted it for themselves. But that's why you have the conversation. Like there's that group. Kind of their cultural background was not one where they would have thought, oh yeah, the Crusades are seen as a really bad thing by 95% of the rest of the world, because of the bubble that they live in. And when you explain it, they're kind of like, oh yeah, okay, fair enough, and off they go and it changes. But you still have to have those things. So, but I think you can have the familiar. I was thinking about good examples. Most of mine were for writing and books, but. Lucy Handsome has done, the author Lucy Handsome has done this really well. Stark Holborn, if you've not read Tenlo or Hell's 8, they are kind of creepy sci-fi westerns done in absolutely the best way. I have loads of time for Stark, she's great. Kelly Link, we've already mentioned Simon Jimenez, but I also think films like Moana and TV shows like Umbrella Academy have done these things kind of really well. They've kind of taken something really novel and made it feel familiar and slightly, unhinged or whatever, but really, really great. And then there are people, again, authors like Tade Thompson and Juliet McKenna. Juliet McKenna in particular has done a whole series of retelling kind of Arthurian tales. It's called the Green Man Saga, or Green Man series. And I think she's done a really good job there and it's contemporary, but she's done a really good job there of kind of showing how you take something and make it new and make it and retell it in a way that you feel like, oh, okay, there's no sense here that this isn't a tale for me. So she's written it in a way which I think is really inclusive. So I think you can look at hooks. So we've just introduced a new faction. That faction it's drawn inspiration from a number of places, but nothing within it will be culturally recognisable as, oh, that comes from Italy, or that comes from Hawaii, or that comes from Argentina. There will be nothing like that in it, but at the same time, you'll be like, oh, okay, this feels familiar, or I think it feels familiar to people, and that's kind of the tightrope that we're trying to walk, because we want people to feel like that's the thing that they can do. It's not to stifle creativity, but it's to find a way of kind of presenting new worlds in a way that people don't immediately go, oh yeah, that's not for me. And that's kind of feels like a really simple thing to achieve, but I think we've found that it's quite a challenge, because there's always something where you're like, oh yeah, that's right. So we've just so one thing we moved to about 2 years ago was saying all our character briefs have to be written in a gender neutral style, so that any of our game team can play them, because too often we were seeing and you can understand why, but Thor was played by a man, and or it was it was the king, or the leader was written as a he, of a little, the bandit group was, he is going to do this, and we were like, okay, that all needs to change, right? Partly so that we remind ourselves on an encounter by encounter basis that it doesn't need to be like that, but also because we have really great representation across genders, and we really want to make sure that people, when they're coming up to kind of do their social contract and do a bit of monstering or NPCing for us, don't feel like they're kind of, oh, I'm going to have to be in a ball gown, or I'm going to have to wear plate armour because I'm a man. But that there's opportunities across the spectrum for everyone, and I think that's worked quite well. The kids have been hilarious. We did a fairy tale retelling of Cinderella, and I played Cinderella, and a friend of mine, Aaron, played the prince. And the kids were like,
did you manage to find a slipper that fits? That's the question.
No, but he did have a ring. Yeah, he did have a ring that he could put on my finger, which was fine. But the kids said to me, you can't be Cinderella. And I said, why can't I be Cinderella? And they went, all right, and off we went. And it's not to kind of say that there's a right or wrong about that tale, but we just wanted to kind of play with it and say, look, there are other ways of telling these stories. And they rescued me, and they made sure that I found my prince, and it was great, and it was a lot of fun. And I've seen that before with the young people. They suddenly go, oh, that's not the way it's supposed to be, and you ask them why not, and then they go, oh, there's no good reason, and off they go, and they're quite happy to kind of adjust their mindset, and then the next time they're ready for it. But you see, and so I'm a little bit like, that's a good place to have those conversations. If they're not happy about it, then they're not happy, and we address the situation. But most of the time, the kids, younger players, are just like, yeah, okay, yeah, my assumption was this. They don't even think about it as my assumption was this. They just kind of go, you can almost see their brains going as they change rails, and then they're totally fine. So I guess as we've got a bit of time, what I wanted to kind of do is kind of say to you, what does good look like for you, in terms of if you were thinking about a game, and if you were thinking about the type of game you wanted to play, what would good look like? And I'm going to split that into two parts. The first is, as a game, what does the world look like? What are the type of people that you could play look like? What are the stories that you can tell? What type of stuff do you want to explore? There's no reason that it's just one thing. Like the bigger the game, the more types of stories you can explore, right? Because you've got more resources and you've got more things to do. But I'm going to throw that to you and just say, what does good look like? Because I don't have all the answers. This is my journey too.
So there's so many elements to this question. For me, there is like a definite issue with accessibility, not for me personally, but I see it around me, because my personal accessibility needs are accounted for in the game that I play, and so that is fine, but I see it around me. I think what I would like to see is more ways to play the game, more ways to get involved for people with different access needs that are not, you're not like fed into one. So it's like, okay, well, if you're physically unable to fight or like physically unwilling to fight because you'll pay for it next week, you know, you're not forced to do a politics thing. You could maybe do a magic thing instead. Like there are other options. Like maybe it would be nice if I nearly used a very specific word for the game I play, but I'm not going to do that. Maybe it would be nice if people who are not physically able to fight could go out on encounters and not fight. Maybe it would be great to come up with a way they can fight without having to be super
like have a body double almost, but then that just kind of leans into the ableist kind of approach. I know it isn't it? So even when you try and mitigate for it, you end up feeding into it, and that's kind of
Well, this is a discussion to be had, isn't it, about like how you mitigate for it and like what ways that could happen. I think part of that is more crew. I think that some LARPs need more crew.
It's just jumping off that, I keep seeing at CP we have usually quite a fair few things that are specifically at least designed for non-com things, or like they'll be running in tandem, like especially at some of the cheap faction events I've been to, they've been, there is a big fight going on, there is this specifically non-com thing we need to solve the problem. We can't be doing this if we're in the middle of the fight. So if people can't fight or do not wish to fight, there is always things to do.
That's a really
so
good
that
example.
connectivity between those elements.
A lot of a great example was there was a few faction events ago. It was a specific way to how we were starting the event. So we said, right, if anyone wishes to not do a combat walk on, they were basically put into an escape room, and they had to like figure out how to drop these defenses so we could get into the actual place where the event was being held. So while we were all fighting around, I think it was werewolves. I can't even remember what was fighting. But it was really nice to basically see the different approaches and how you wanted to, but they were also effectively factoring in the fact that people can change hour by hour. So that they're going, okay, if I was fighting initially one day and the next day I do not feel comfortable already, they're like, that's fine. You can change it to basically be doing the other stuff. That's entirely up to you. So I think I personally think I've been seeing it a lot, especially at CP, because I've been playing it since 2014, I think. And I'm loving the changes that's been happening. Absolutely, especially E1. I love how you guys ran the conclave specifically, because it was a big multiplanar council, and they were like specifically each faction must have a representative, no one of rank. So that means none of the big veteran players that like to hoover up all the cool stuff could go. There had to be a somewhat veteran representative, and then a brand new player. So it doesn't matter if you're combat, doesn't matter if you're non-combat, completely whoever wishes to do it. It was really nice to see, because me being the rank going, oh cool, I can't get involved in the cool thing, that means other people have to do it. Great, I can actually have some time to go do other stuff and go have fun. It's brilliant, I loved it.
It created chaos in character because there were lots of people like, but this is my role to do this, and we were like,
it doesn't matter.
Obviously we weren't saying anything, but behind the scenes I was like, yes, it was written to make life difficult for you. It forced you to kind of.
It made life difficult for the NPCs after that as well.
Yeah, I think. Sorry, go on.
I had a really good example of that from CP, and I don't remember the specifics. Obviously, I won't share the name, but basically, someone was saying that game had come to their friend in their camp, and their friend was not mobile. They were essentially stuck in camp. The game literally went to them. Plot just happened, which is so good. It's so helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because, like 10 years ago, I reckon, like the thing that Curious Pastimes was about was big battles, and 90% of the player base turned up to do big battle at some point during the event. I reckon 35 to 40% of our player base now does not want to do fighting, and it's taken us a little bit of time to kind of get our heads around that, because when that first shift first starts to happen, you don't necessarily identify it as a trend. So you might think, oh, our players are just being rubbish at their social contract and not turning up to do their stuff. And then you kind of this helps being able to put on a tabard and go out and kind of be invisible and just observe. But then you realise that actually no, people are choosing to play a character type where they don't want to do that, or they're coming to the game unable to do that, but they still want to play because that's why they're coming to the game, right? And so we've kind of caught up with ourselves and kind of got over this idea that was the type of game we were, and we still run those big things. We still think of them as kind of USPs for the system that we run, but at the same time we're like, okay, it's now a different world. We've got a much bigger player base. They want to do different things. So how do we give this community what it wants?
So in relation to the percentage change we just indicated, is that because that core is still there and it was always there and the player base has expanded around it, or is it that shrunk a little bit as well as the player base has expanded?
I think part of that original player base has got a bit older. And are less able to run up and down hills and hit each other around the head than when they were in their 20s. I think we have seen a lot of growth, and that growth has brought with it people who are like, well, that's fun, I don't mind it, but actually the reason I'm here is because I love lore. And you guys have got 30 years of lore, and it's all accessible if I go and search it up.
In relation to changes, have you had to abandon a lot of that lore, or has it just been mutated into?
Yeah. Probably abandoned, quietly kind of, that's not how we do it anymore.
Yeah.
And occasionally a really old player will go, but this has been the way it's been for 30 years. And we're like, it's not been that way for the last 10.
It's a new world now.
Yeah, so...
It's different.
Yeah, so yes, some has been abandoned. Some of it we've kind of, like the stuff around race, we've explicitly said we're not having... First of all, we said we're going to stop it having any mechanical effect on the game. So as the rules are on the website today, it still does. But by the end of this year, that will all be gone. And then I was like, we need to take it a step further, because I don't want people still thinking in that sense. And people are like, well, what about lineage or heritage? I'm like, no, it's just moving the problem under a different name. So I was like, let's get rid of it all.
And that lineage and heritage stuff connects with what I was thinking in relation to what a good system looks like. For me, it's one that doesn't mirror the societal hierarchies which we currently have.
Yeah.
And every single system which I've looked at tends to mirror in some capacity what we have.
Yeah.
And I find that problematic.
So,
how do you move away from that, though?
So one of the great things that we've been able to do, because from the beginning, the game world is vast and much bigger than the bit of the world that the players inhabit. We've got all sorts of other cultures and entities in the game world. And so we've been able to write cultures that are entirely meritocratic, cultures that run on social obligation, mafia-type cultures. We've got a bunch of cultures that are kind of driven purely by like status, but not in a social sense, but in a material sense. We've got direct democracies. We've got like the people that in Battle 1 where the players lost on the plane of fate. They're entirely they're a society of individuals, like purely like the Plato's cave version of individualists. Yeah. So we've got so it's allowed us to write into the world all these different ways of being that then the players come up against and have to engage with, and that you see them kind of going, oh, I'm going to talk to you like this because this is how we get things done, and those NPCs are like, oh, what nonsense is this that you're talking? This is not how we do things at all. And so at the event we ran recently, because it was like a United Nations event, the various NPCs had red lines that if they behave, they were all different because they all came from very different cultures. If the players did stuff over the red line, they'd be like, I'm not talking to you again. Right? Some of them were like, if you are an individualist, and some of them were like, oh well, if you're put the community first rather than yourself, right? So it was spread across all these different types of social being, and the players, like, they figured it out and they got to it, and they were like, oh yeah, okay, so there's these different ways of dealing with different people. That for me is like that's step one, is that you're helping people see that there are other ways of organising. Because I think people do default to that because it's what they know and it's what they've seen. It's why you see a preponderance of kings and queens and barons and baronesses, because people are like, oh, I don't want to be a king, so I'm going to be a baron. And you're like, okay, fine, great. It's the same thing, guy. It's the same. Yeah. So we've seen that. We've seen people kind of take that on board. I think the other thing that's really challenging, which I don't have a good answer to, is how we portray faith effectively in a respectful way. I think, like, modern Western faith is privatized, right? It's suffered under capitalism as everything else has, and there's very little public expression of community-based faith now, apart from royal deaths and stuff like that, right? Royal weddings, and but otherwise it's entirely co-opted by capitalism, and I think that makes it a materialistic capitalism. It makes it very hard for us in the West to tell stories about faith in a way that would be recognisable to people outside of that system. so I think that's something we're still trying to grapple with, because I'm like, I would really like to tell those stories, but in some ways there's such alien ways of being that we really struggle to kind of provide a sense of what it means to live in that way. And my friend Gavin Smith is like, look, he's a historian amongst other things, and he's like, look, we don't have a magical worldview in the West, and that's the biggest problem. Everything's compartmentalized and it's largely materialistic, and that's why you see magic systems rather than magic being something that infuses the world and everything's connected. He's like, when you've got a magic system, it's really just a pseudoscience. It's not actually. It's a consumable, right? It's not actually
alchemy as opposed to.
It's maths.
But then, you know, Isaac Newton was an alchemist, and I suspect he wouldn't recognise what we would call alchemy as alchemy, because for him it was based absolutely in his worldview about God being at the centre of the universe and the universe having order, because the ground of being was a divine being, right? The ground of all our beings was a divine being. So I think we struggle with that, but that's for me is like that's a nut I want to crack, because I think that's also really instructive for us, kind of deconstructing some of that materialism that capitalism is putting our way. Whether we're atheists or not, I think it's helpful for us to kind of be able to think about those things in a different way. In the same way that I'm never going to be a communist, but it is actually super useful to be able to kind of understand what the attractions are and how you would think as communitarianism is really different to communism, but how you might think with those different worldviews and what type of stories would be important to you, and what type of values would be important to you. Because there are people who are going to come to your games looking for those things, and finding them is what's going to keep them there. So, yeah. So to answer your question, like from ages ago, about coming in a different colour skin.
Mm-hmm. I can pause this if you want to.
No, it's fine. I don't mind.
Yeah.
My view is I wouldn't want to see you with my colour skin. I have no problem with you coming with blue and green and black, kind of mottled or whatever, but I wouldn't want to see you playing a brown person.
But to throw a curveball,
yeah,
and purely playing devil's advocate here.
Yeah.
If you're a female and you saw a male character per individual playing female, what's the distinction? I'm not suggesting that that's right. I'm just
me, and this is just my view. For me, gender is a construct, whereas my colour of my skin is not.
Yeah.
But that arguably is an extension of the same argument. There's a genetic, scientific component to it, and when you look at the spectrum.
Yeah, but not in an essentialist way.
Yeah.
It's more that I can't do anything about this, and I'm not saying people can do something about the gender that they feel at all. But what I'm saying is that society constructs its views, well, it also constructs its views of me, but it constructs those in a way that I think is more fluid and is more open to exploration and has less legacy of problems than a man in blackface or me in whiteface, frankly.
So it's one of those where how much do you want to engage with it, even if you wanted to engage with it, is it at the moment still?
So I think in a really small game, and this is where I think there's a big difference between big games and little games. In a really small game of, let's say, 40 players, where you can build a level of trust, where you could potentially, as long as no one's taking photos that can be taken out of context, you could potentially explore those themes, as long as everybody was consenting. With 1,000 people, or even with 300, there's too many people on the ground to build that relationship and to have that conversation in a sensible way. So I played a game a few years ago called Weird West, which was a great game with a terrible ending. It was infamously terrible. But the game itself was fantastic. And I played a member of the East India Company, and my background was we had no background, we weren't allowed to talk about it. But I played an Indian, and I played an Indian who was in the New World for reasons, and that allowed me to interrogate the absurdity of cowboy culture as someone coming from India, and kind of going, what is this nonsense? And kind of talk about that. But I kind of talked, I went with a big group of 8, there were only 35 players, all of whom I got to know kind of pretty well. And I was able to say, look, I'm going to be kind of calling you out on some of these stuff when they come. It's just part of the game. If you want to talk about it outside of that, that's absolutely fine. Let's do that. It's partly me exploring it for myself because I'm still figuring out how to talk about these things, but it's also because I feel safe here to do that with you. Is that okay? And that's okay. I think it's much more of a struggle to do that, but it's impossible, I would say, to do that
In larger numbers,
Yeah.
where you don't have that one-to-one conversation.
Yeah, so we've essentially said for our big games, we're not going to cover this sort of material in our plot and our stories because there's too much risk of it going wrong, and we don't want to, like, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? We don't want to do something for the right reason and it go completely tits up. So we're just not going to do it.
It's baby steps as well,
Yeah.
sometimes in relation to dealing with matters, isn't it? So you don't go to the end point.
No.
Yeah.
Good
But
fun
in super
one,
small
yeah.
games, we've run some really small games. Those, I think, we're more open to the idea of, you want to play that is potentially problematic. Let's talk about how we do that in the game so that nobody feels like that's a problem for them.
Because and Larp is it's just so light. Like the whole idea is getting more people involved, not less. So in sort of anything that creates a barrier or even just a worry for people, like for me, I don't know anything about running Larp games, but I'd probably personally take a really extreme view of it. I'd be like, no, just you use your colour skin, that's it, you can't have blue. Like, I understand the whole not, like, I'm totally on board with the whole, like, banning other human skin colours that are in real life. For me personally, I think just making it a blanket thing might make my life easier if I was doing a job like yours. I would just be like, let's just not, you know?
Yeah. We want high fantasy. We want there to be spectacle.
Yeah.
If there was no immediate place my mind went to when I saw a white man in brown or black makeup, then it would be fine. But there is, and it comes with a massive amount of legacy.
It's got a history.
Yeah.
Attached to it, ultimately.
And that's really tricky. And it's why, we've got rid of the concept of drow completely. But it's why when people are like, well, what's the problem with playing a black elf? And I'm like, okay, we have to take a few steps back.
Also, like, they come in purple. Drow come in, just do purple. Like, it's not that hard.
I mean, for CB, obviously there's been grey, there's been purple, there's been like deep blues and all that. Some people put really decent effort in. It's really cool to see.
Yeah, and we're like, go mad.
Yeah, absolutely go mad.
The worst thing we want, no matter what colour it is just matte block of colour. What we want is kind of go mad with the makeup, and So we have a long list of kind of bigger props and kit that we want to do as we kind of get to grips with where we are now. But
yeah, it's interesting. Just I have interacted with people in game in orc masks that I personally felt were not like appropriate. And to be honest, and I'm saying this as a white person, so like this is a white person's experience of this. I was more upset by the colour of face paint they had to use to match the mask colour than the mask itself. But I was like, why is your mask that colour? You had to order that. You had to order that. And you had to ask for it in that colour. Why is it brown? Like I don't actually know if that's on the brief because I would never have ordered a brown one. I ordered a green one. But like the fact that they had to go out and buy face paint in a colour that is a human skin colour to match that mask, that made me uncomfortable as a white person. So I'm like, how does that make other people feel? So
my rule of thumb has been, I don't want to go and get made up as an NPC where I'm having to put my own skin colour on top of my skin colour.
Yeah.
I don't want any monsters that are in that category, and I don't want anybody who's a person of colour with a different skin colour to feel the same way. Because for years I just refused. I'm like, I'm already brown. I don't need brown. And now I'm in a position to say we don't do that anymore. We change it, please.
Oh, but actually, so now the brain cogs are wearing. I'm thinking now, I can kind of see an argument for like people who have that skin colour choosing that they don't want to wear the face paint and they actually want their orc to be that colour. I can kind of see that. I mean, it's not really a discussion for me to be part of, but I can see that train of thought. Like if you're not going to have to put the face paint on, potentially, I don't know. Yeah.
But then I'm just a brown person playing an orc, and I'm like,
And then it's like uncomfortable for different reasons. Yeah.
I'm like really leaning into the brown people are barbaric. Oh,
Yeah, I hate it.
You were gonna.
I've got a thought mulling.
Okay.
Working on wearing away.
So I think we're nearly time up. So my feeling is look, this is not. Larp is brilliant, and I absolutely love it, and I've been doing it a long time, and I'm kind of trying to indoctrinate my children too. But I feel like downstairs there are 50,000 people in the hall, of whom about 10,000 to 12,000 are people who are like me and who aren't LARPing. And I'm like, I want you guys LARPing. I want you people LARPing. Because you'll love it. You just don't know it yet, right? It'll be a hobby that you're happy to spend all your money on because it's so great.
We'll have no more money.
Yeah, but I'm like,
that actually connects with what my thought was.
Go on.
And I'm going to throw it out here. Okay, so the statistical evidence indicates that those in the lower deprivation indices tend to be from certain cultural backgrounds. Is money one of the ultimate reasons as to why certain groups of individuals find it harder for that gateway?
I don't think so. Mainly because we get people from all walks of life, and so I don't think that's a reason. I think those statistics are relatively right, but they're a proportional basis, right? So absolute numbers, no. But even if that was an issue, I don't think so. I think so. When we've been downstairs saying to people, they're like, "Oh, how much does an event cost?" And we're like, "Well, 85 quid for 3 days." And they're like, "Oh, and what's my pitch fee?" We're like, "Well, there is no pitch fee." And they're like, "Oh, so I just get to put my tent up." And we're like, "And what about the car park?" We're like, "Oh, well, that's free too." And they're like, "Oh," and so I think in that sense, it's great value. Don't get me wrong. Our costs can quickly stack up, right? And kit can cost literally as much as you want to spend on it. But I don't think that, or at least we are conscious that we're not trying to build a game where that isn't gatekeeping.
I think because of the kind of needs of immersion, it can be like, cost can be a barrier, but there are at least people in the community trying to reduce that barrier for anyone. So.
Yeah, and we have some amazing community members. One of them runs a kit library for people who want to borrow kit, and most of our game, if you come for the first time and you kind of join Discord or whatever, or if you're old, you join the Facebook pages. Yeah, and you say to people, "It's my first event. What shall I do for kit?" There's nearly always somebody who will stand up and go, "I can lend you weapons, or I can lend you this." And if you don't like it, then you've not spent any money. And I think there are loads of ways of coming into the community, and that's one of the things that I think is really profound about the community, is that the community is super welcoming on the whole. Not necessarily the smaller the game. I think you struggle a little bit above certain sizes, but I think that's a little bit about how you organise your game, so that you can keep it human in terms of interaction. But I think generally the community does a great job at being welcoming when people finally turn up. So.
I realize we're probably running over, but I have another thought about what a good game looks like to me in terms of diversity. So I personally find Larp to be a very, very diverse place in terms of queerness. So gender, sexuality, different relationship setups, like polyamory, monogamy. I find it to be people to be so open about that kind of thing. And Larp is a place they feel so safe expressing that, and I find it really good for gender as well. I think there's a really, really good split in the game I play.
Yeah.
I don't even think there are more men. I think it's probably about even between male and female. There are obviously less people who are different genders, but those people are open about what gender they are, if they're not male or female, which is really nice. I want to see a game that does that for people who aren't white, and I want a game, and this, selfishly, I want a game that makes it easy for me as a white person to support that, to make that happen for people who aren't white, because it's crazy that we have such good diversity in other areas, and it's like, why isn't it happening here? I obviously we've covered some of the reasons why, but they almost don't seem like good enough. I want better. Why is it?
I think it's about helping people see themselves playing and seeing themselves in the game. So
it can't be helped by things like Big Bang Theory having zero diversity in it.
Well,
that'd be one of the kind of
I mean, some of that doesn't help. But I look at my work in publishing. I'm doing some stuff about diversity in the publishing industry, and you look at the stats there, and it's 97% white. It's also deeply classist as an industry. It's 97% white, middle class, and by middle class I mean people who can afford to do internships for free. I don't even mean kind of what most people mean by middle class. So I think it's tough, and you see people kind of going, well, it's not for me, and you kind of probe that a little bit, and you go, why? Well, they go, well, there's nobody, I can't see myself in it. And I remember talking to a guy at LinkedIn years ago now, and he was like, we're really struggling to kind of get women to join the company. I was like, okay, do you go to Curious Pastimes? He was like, yeah, we go to all of them, we're really struggling. I said, is it all men on your team? And he went, I said, why aren't there any women on your team? He was like, I don't know. And off he went. And I was like, there's a big answer, because if you don't see yourself across the other side of the table, representation it's not sufficient, but it is absolutely necessary, right, as a condition.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Right, I think we're probably done. So before they kick us out, so thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Cool. Good.